Hi, folks, and welcome to another episode of the Leadership Tales podcast. My name is Colin Hunter, and I'm your host. Delighted to welcome to this episode this gentleman, Ken Mossman, who you're going to hear from today, has had a big impact in a very short space of time. He was recommended via Contact Brian, where she'd done Ken's course, which we're going to talk about today. And it's fundamentally, it's a bit about getting yourself as a man to a better adult version of yourself, to allow yourself to have a better impact in society. And having chatted to himself, to Brian, and listened to some of the content from participants that they got out of it, for me, it's a game changer for me. I'm looking to sign up to do this course this year, and it's just a different perspective on the way to do things. And I also just love Ken. So enjoy this conversation. So Ken, welcome to the Leadership Tales podcast. Tell the world who you are. And if somebody is not watching the visual, they need to know about this mustache that you've got in the handlebar. They've got to know about this, but tell us a bit about yourself, sir. Yeah.
Well, let's start with the mustache because it's a recent thing, and it's a funny thing that you mention it, Colin. Of course, because I suppose it presents it's more front and center than my eyes to some degree, I guess, because my nose comes in first, and then the mustache, and then the rest of my head. This is a relatively recent thing. I haven't had any facial hair since, I don't know, sometime in the 1980s, I suppose. And there was something about COVID.
Just something
about COVID, where it just seemed like my son made a commitment to not shave or cut his hair for 3 years. And we're coming up on 3 years now. And man, I was like, yeah, you know what? I'll see if I can grow a beard. And
love it.
And sure enough, I could. And then the mustache just kind of, had a mind of its own. And there was the purchase of some wax. So now it has in fact become a thing.
A thing. I love that. I also just love the playing with it as if people are not watching the visual, get on the visual and have a look at it. It's great. It's well worth it just for that. I love it. Ken, tell us a bit about your background. Tell us your story about how you got here.
Yeah. Good. I'll start with this. I've done a lot of different things. And a joke, but there's of course some truth to it, is that I think of myself as a Renaissance man. If I'm looking at my history, I have 2 degrees in fine arts, visual arts. I taught skiing for a number of years. I coached a college racing team. I was a professional baker for years, a sous-chef. Spent a lot of time in commercial kitchens. Thinking that would be a way of funding my art habit, and then quickly discovered that those gigs left zero gas in the tank for much of anything except, shower, sleep, and start all over the next day. But I consider myself kind of a Renaissance man because I've done all of these different things. Owned a personal fitness training business for a number of years, a business with my sister. We taught continuing education workshop. I've done a lot of different things. Anyway, I think of myself as a Renaissance man. The joke is that my wife thinks of me more as just completely unfocused. There's truth in both perspectives.
Feedback is a gift.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I found my way to the world. I'm going to talk first about coaching with a little bit of backstory before that. Just about anything I did, I would find myself kind of slipped into positions of leadership or seen in a given group as having leadership potential. I made my way to coaching through some executives that I was working with as a personal fitness trainer, and one in particular who really, I think, saw something in me that I wasn't able to see in myself. and a senior VP at a very large international bank. And I stepped into that world, that being the world of coaching and leadership training as well. And I just never looked back. I felt like I had come home, and that was going on 23 years ago now. So, and then, I think one of the big pieces that fell into place was around working with men. I'll say this, I was late to the fatherhood game. My wife and I met later. We were both 28 at the time. And, I had my business. She had a profession. We had a number of there's more to the story than that. There were a number of miscarriages, et cetera. It was a bit of a tough row to hoe in terms of finally having our son, who's 24 now. But he was born when I was just 6 months into. I was 40, and Danielle, my wife, was just a few weeks shy of turning 40. So I came to fatherhood late. Mm-hmm. And there was, something about working with men. Who's the most interesting person on any given day? I think if most of us are honest, it's the one that we face in the mirror.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't look that great in the morning. It might surprise you, but I don't look that great in the morning.
You're blessed. You have hairs that are out of place on the top of your head. That's good. I have my wax. But looking in the mirror, I was like, oh, you know what? There's, I'm not the only one in this position. And having grown up in the shadow of the women's movement, 60s and 70s, the shadow of Vietnam, et cetera. There was some confusion about what it was to stand in a man's shoes, to be a man. And then specifically in the beginning, it was really about men who came to fatherhood late and the challenges that they were facing. But then as my son grew older, things changed and my lens opened up a bit. And I started to ask, I think, broader questions. And I also started to see patterns, out there in terms of what men were facing and how they were showing up or not. So that was a long-winded answer to a beautifully short question.
No, but I love it. And I think this is the unique piece, Ken, for me, that, we've connected, we've had conversations. But the way, because anybody listening at the moment going, particularly the women, and probably going, well, hold on a second, we're still not, it's the age of women at the moment. We still need to sort this. But actually what you're talking about, and particularly the program that you've been running, is something that's different, which I love. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm curious if I could pop a question back to you. You said there's something that's different. What are you seeing that's different? And maybe we can have some conversation about that.
Yeah, because I think for me, the difference that I see is that as a man, in a world where women quite rightly are now getting more traction. I'm a father of daughters. Yeah. So that's how I describe myself, because I want women to have more place, more opportunity. And therefore, it's almost step aside, Colin, while we give the opportunity for others to fly, whether it's women, and I'm going to include other neurodiversity, other areas of this world that need the opportunity to fly. However, to step aside is a difficult thing, because where's your place then? So, where do you sit? How do you act? And then I look at young men nowadays, boys who I know through families who have sons, and I honestly don't know how I'd work out what I should be doing and how I should be doing things now. And so therefore it's a unique way of helping men to be allies to the rest of society, is the way I see it, which I love the uniqueness. That was my flavor. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting language that you're using, step aside, because I'm one of the things that I'm reading Richard Reeves of Boys and Men right now. Great book, really beautifully studied and researched. You can look at the results that we're seeing right now and saying, oh, okay, to a certain degree, men have stepped aside as women have ascended. And really what he's saying is there's a lot of either or happening. There's a lot of either or happening, and we've gone down the rabbit hole of either or. He says something else that I think is really kind of interesting, because he also says, in terms of the crisis with that's going on with where younger men, boys and men, and even men who look like you and I have a little more gray than you, but still, middle-aged men, etc. From a political standpoint, the political right, the conservatives want to drag us back to the, what was so much better in the 50s, as an example, and the political left wants to deny that there's a problem. And of course, neither of those is useful. Neither of those points of view or holding it that way is ways of holding it are useful. And so one of the things that he's pointing to, and I'm still relatively early in the book, is we need to find a way to not have it be either or, to not get out of the way, but to move forward together. And part of that lives in the arena of education. Part of that lives in the recognition that, yes, boys mature more slowly than girls do, and our institutions, our educational institutions, aren't set up to take any of that into account. There's more to it, but there's more to it, but I'll rest there.
Yeah. One of the things I realized about myself last week was that, I decided to stop arguing because I just didn't like myself when I was in arguing mode. And as I was thinking about it, I also realized I'd stop arguing with women, not men, but I'd stopped arguing with women. And then I realized, one of my great friends, Leon Davey, has about positive conflict and about conflict debt that we hold if we don't get our views out in there. So none of this is binary, as you've hinted at and talked in here. We've got to find a better way of having conversations and, as you say, not stepping aside, but working with people. So what do you do with the men going through the program? Because the program is called I Am. Yeah. Very simple title. You could stick Will I Am at the beginning, and then link. But I Am. But the concepts are quite powerful. What's it about?
Yeah, I think the concepts are very powerful. So you mentioned messaging before, and a little bit of context. So or a big piece of context for the program addresses messaging, and that is those of us in Western culture, from the time we're able to live in the world of language, have these messages thrown at us, and oftentimes they're messages about what it is to be a man, what's manhood, what's masculine, what's manly, etc. Yet it's pretty darn rare that we receive messages about what it is to be a conscious, whole adult. And a little bit of editorializing here, if I may. And what we see, in the world, out in the world, in the media, in the world of leadership, all over the place, is we see an awful lot of men. The culture, anyway, is kind of locked into a state of adolescence, but I think particularly men get locked into this endless adolescent feedback loop that includes entitlement, a certain kind of irresponsibility. There's a lot to it. I could talk about it for days. I'm not going to go down that path right now. unless you have a specific question. But the program starts with that premise that we hear an awful lot about what it is to be a man, what it means, in air quotes, what it means to be a man, what masculinity is, what manhood is, but not a great deal about responsible adulthood. And what we do in the program is we refamiliarize ourselves with different aspects of self, our multidimensionality. So let's find that inner child and get to know him in real time, by the way. So we're not taking a backward glance, but getting to know that inner child here, now, today. These bits and pieces that are parts of us and always will be parts of us, as long as we're willing to be aware of them. Our inner adolescent, our inner young adult, looking at our inner feminine, our inner masculine, and all the different aspects of the ego, really taking each of these pieces, looking at the messages that they got and the messages that they continue to carry unconsciously, so we can start to unwrap those and free ourselves from those messages and become aware. That's the biggest thing, is become aware of, oh wow, this one's got me by the ankle, or somewhere higher up, Yep. I'm not even aware of it. I'm not even aware of it. And you mentioned the arguing, and I think that's really, really an important piece. And because part of it is, what are we driving toward? Well, we're driving toward being able to engage the world as through an adult lens. So when it comes to conflict, when it comes to argument, I can show up as an adult in the equation, and the chances are I'm not going to get rattled. I might, that happens to everybody. These things are practices, but there's something about being able to show up in one's adult morph, if I may say that, use that language, in one's adult morph, and meet other people, as adults, rather than in family is a great place to look, because oftentimes when we're with family, depending on the relationship with family, it's like, boom, right back. I was 45 when I stopped the car in front of my folks' house, but by the time I went through the front door, I was 13 again.
Yes. Know what you mean.
Yeah. And wouldn't it be refreshing then to be able to carry that change and, change the face of that relationship, to say nothing of all the others.
And it is fascinating for me, because it goes back to something I've mentioned on this podcast a while ago. But Jamie Smart, who wrote the book Clarity, once gave me the analogy of, as a child, we have a self-correcting mind, and therefore it's almost the power of our conscious mind in those days is strong enough. Imagine the Colorado River cutting through canyons. But as we grow older, we just freeze that thinking. We get all these messages, myths, as you say. And as a man in this context, we get all of these things, which is, okay, so I need to do X, Y, I need to be this mode. So we have this trickle of consciousness. So we freeze up. And it's fascinating to me, as one of my daughters is one of the best coaches I've had through my life. But she once told me that when I was chatting to, and I thought I was chatting to two of our neighbors' kids, she said, "Dad, do you realize you're a very scary person? So you scare people." And I took that, whoa, what do you mean scary? And she said, because you're a big bloke, yeah, your voice is strong, and therefore you are. So I consciously have been trying to diminish my voice. So it's almost it's removing the power from ourselves. But what you're talking about is release those. Find that inner child that didn't care what people thought, just explored, experimented, and learned by seeing the reaction on other people's faces. That's what you're talking about, yeah?
That's a big piece of it, yeah. And learn to, I'm going to say, learn, if we're going to isolate the inner child for a little bit, learn to channel his and partner with him and channel, open oneself up to his curiosity, his creativity, his desire to learn. We're all such hungry learners as kids, and of course it's innate. It's just part of the child operating system. But to your point, yeah, absolutely, we cut those things off. We're taught to cut those things off in many ways. And one of the pieces that I mention often in the course is, in that example, if I've cut myself off from the inner child, as an example, or I've cut myself off from my emotional experience or from, name an aspect of oneself. But if I cut myself off, a separation from any part of self is a separation from self. There's kind of an absolute nature to that. And when we do, try to, it's like cutting off a limb. It's like cutting off a limb. And then we're wondering, well, why am I feeling the way that I'm feeling? Why am I having this experience? Well, you've cut part of yourself off. Life is hard that way.
And they also say that when you lose a limb, or, people lose limbs, they still believe it's there. It's almost this part I was listening to a big fan of the High Performance podcast, and they were talking about the ghosts of your childhood rattling around in us as adults. And it's the same thing. If you cut off part of you, it's still rattling around in there somewhere and having an impact on it. So why not bring the voice to the party? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Rather than being haunted by the ghost, make friends with the child.
Yeah. I love it. So many analogies mixed up in here. It's just parties and all those things. But
the other thing about separating from self is that it is, it's lonely. Let's just call it what it is. It's bloody lonely. And so being in community, being in conversation, recognizing, being able to do the kind of work that says, you know what, I'm not the only one. Who knew?
Who knew?
Who knew?
Yeah, I was in a lovely conference last year with ISA that I go to every year, and there was an exercise in the final day, and it was one of these. It's one that they use at Harvard for developing their staff, going through it. But the part of the exercise, you go through and you start to talk about yourself, and you talk about your drivers and what you're trying to live and breathe. And it was funny because the two people who stood up were two Brits, myself and another guy. And as we went through, we would share after every part of the exercise. And they were saying, so you're still comfortable? I said, yeah, I'm still comfortable to go here. But when it's stripped back, I always remember the most powerful moment. And I delivered what I would call my blah, blah statement at the end to the final question. It was blah, 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 talk about some rubbish, Colin, that other people might buy into. And the facilitator up front just called me, and then she said, she didn't quite use blah, blah, but she said something more politely. She said, really? And it goes back to the lonely piece, which is I stood up in front of 150 of my peers globally and just said, yeah, I don't want to be lonely. Yeah. And I think I heard a yay from everybody in that room. Yeah. Female, male, whatever the background.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the important part of your program for us. Yeah. Is that moment of going, you're not alone. You got other people to talk to. But we all are individual. It's about the power of that collective. Yeah.
Right. And to hold both of those things at the same time. Of course, again, that speaks to one of the myths that we're either spoon-fed or force-fed or a combination. And that is that, this notion of, if it's to be, it's up to me. Well, on the one hand, there's some truth to that. On the other hand, what's far more true is that unless you're in a cave, unless you're a hunter-gatherer living in a cave by yourself, miles away from other human beings, nobody does it alone. Where do you get your food? Do you buy it from a store? That involves other people. If you're in business, do people buy from you? That involves other people. Do you have products shipped to you? That involves other people. Raj Sisodia talks about these, he's talking about it in a business context, but these expanding circles of stakeholders that, when one is willing to see, and this is an adult function, being able to see the world and all of the different nesting systems that make up the bigger world, it becomes very clear very quickly that, we're really not alone. It's actually not a useful option.
For me, that's what you're talking about here, which is what's the community? We're not alone, but how do you get us almost a support community around you to rebuild your sense of almost worth and self into a world where you can be helpful for others as well as yourself?
Yeah. I don't want to say it starts as an inside job, because I think there's a way that we can be seduced into focusing over here to the exclusion of the systems around us. I'm doing my work. I'll come back and make a difference after I've done my work. And it's not an if then or a when then or an either or. It's like, oh, okay, engage with the world while you're doing your own work. Engage with the world, and because we kind of harped on the child, or focused on the child for a bit, and this is something that, generally speaking, it's not always true, but it is something that children do very well and very naturally because of that curiosity. They connect. They connect, and they have their disagreements, and they have their they have their conflicts, and then the next moment happens.
And they've forgotten about it.
And it's on to the next thing.
Wouldn't it be great if we as adults could do that?
It would.
And I want to link it into the creativity, because there's a focus in there, because this is where I'm so curious about how this impacts organizations themselves or societal, structures. Because there is something about releasing creativity that comes from the work that you do in here. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, you bet. Creativity gets short shrift in our culture. It tends to get put in a very tight box that's all about art. The arts, the singing, the dancing, the playwriting, the visual art, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The chefing, whatever it happens to be. And with that, there's an awful lot of creative energy that gets used to explain away one's creativity. I'm not creative. I can't draw a straight line. Well, that's a nice image. That's a nice image you just created there. Yeah. How much of your time, energy, and attention goes into convincing yourself and others that you're not creative? That is that's not a particularly useful way to play with your creative energy, but you might want to notice you're doing it. So it's important to expand, and I think this is something that great leaders do, by the way. This is something that great leaders do, is that they tap into their own creativity, and they're able to tap into the creativity of those they lead, and unleash that creativity. And there's a recognition that, okay, creativity is not something that's limited to the world of the arts. Someone writing great code is creative. Someone learning to write code is creative. Someone who's finding, playing in the world of up-leveling their management is making use of their creativity. They're called to their creativity over and over and over again. They might not recognize it as that, but it's really important. And in creativity, to me anyway, there are a few things. There's the endless curiosity that comes with the inner child. That's certainly a piece of it. There's also a sense of endless possibility, and that's more that lives more in the arena of the adolescent who's looking at the world and feeling like they're indestructible, and the world is their oyster. And it's the combination of those things, with the aspect of ourselves that's a more integrated adult, being able to kind of guide those energies. It's like, what's needed here? Let's come up with some creative solutions. Let's look at it in different ways.
I love it. So we could talk for hours and hours and hours. I'm asking a few new questions towards the end of the podcast nowadays, just to get the juices flowing. I'd love these because I'm looking at the artwork behind you. I know the guitars are there. I know the mustache, but I'm fascinated to get your answers to that. So the first one is, what are the small experiences you've had as a leader or in what you do that have been the most memorable in shaping your views as a leader?
Yeah. Let me look. The small experiences. One of the small experiences that had a big impact. One of the small experiences that really kind of like blew my mind.
I know.
Was realizing that was realizing that I was in this particularly around leadership, was realizing that I was in the place where I was because I actually belonged there. It wasn't a mistake.
Yeah. I love that. That is funny because it's almost the imposter syndrome. It's almost like there's a design, there's a plan, but actually you were there for a reason. Yeah,
right. I was there for a reason, and also, to be fair, I had, with help. I didn't do it alone. Absolutely didn't do it alone. But but that I had taken the steps. I had actually taken the steps to get there, and my being there wasn't, it wasn't a strange twist of fate. And and the funny thing is, as I look back at my work history, and this came later, Colin, as I look back at my work history, I could see that, with very few exceptions, one or two, where I did what I did because I thought I was supposed to be chasing dollars. But aside from those, which, as I mentioned, they were only, thank goodness, there were only a few. And I know this is a bit of a cliche, but cliches become cliches because there's some truth to them. I was fortunate. I think there was also an element of mindfulness there, that I followed my passions. I did the things that I wanted to do, and to this day, that's true.
So the second one, if you had to disrupt the one thing that leaders do at the moment in this world, what would it be?
I'm going to borrow a page from Raj, again, Raj Sisodi. I'm going to borrow a page from his playbook. And that is, disrupt the idea that my collection of stakeholders stop at people who actually own shares in my business, or if it's a smaller business, that the stakeholder arena stops at the office door, or the door at the front of the store. It's like those bigger systems.
And then finally, what's the one leadership habit that for you is sacrosanct, non-negotiable, that we should be doing?
Playing.
Oh, love it. and let me ask you a question then, because as a follow-up, what do you mean by playing? Because so many people go, we can't play at work, we can't do this, and it's yeah.
Well, it comes back to learning and creativity and creative expression, because play greases the wheels of learning. It unleashes creativity. I'm sure neuroscientists would tell us all sorts of good things about what it, you mentioned bathing the brain before. I'm sure it does a beautiful job of bathing the brain in things that are not cortisol. And in my observations anyway, people tend to get along differently when they allow themselves to be playful, playful with themselves, playful with one another, playful with the stuff they're working on.
We could talk for ages. If people want to find out more about you, where would they go, Ken, to find out more about you and the programs?
So I have a new website coming, but you can get to my old one right now, and that's kenmossman.com. And that's probably the best place. You can look for me on LinkedIn as well. But I think the website is the best place to go. And if you get to the website and the guy in the images doesn't have a mustache and beard, come back in another couple of weeks, because I swear he will.
It's going to be there.
It's going to be there.
It's going to be there. Ken, I can already see the caricature on the website and the animation in the background with a mustache, and then you'll have to keep it. So it's been a delight. So happy to know you, and the start of what I think is going to be a very welcoming relationship for myself going forward. Thank you for coming on the podcast, and thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah, likewise. It's been a delight, Colin. Thank you so much for having me.
Cheers. Well, that was Ken Mossman. Amazing gentleman, amazing background to where he's come from, his jobs. Just listen to the list of jobs from sous-chef right the way through to the coach and the course I am. Things that struck me from that. One is this concept of creativity and how releasing that concept of our self, our inner child, is massive in there. And I think I loved his analogy about cutting off a limb and being separate and how damaging that is, and how we need to bring it back in to our lives. But I think the second thing for me is he's providing a place and a framework for men in the world where we know we need to change, and we need to shift and change some of the messages and the myths that we've got about what it is to be a man in this world, about masculinity, and how we can help people to do that. And I think it's one thing to say change, but it's another thing to give people a framework and a support mechanism to be able to do that. And I love what he's talking about. I'm looking forward to doing that workshop and having a go. And I'm sure I will talk about it more, either in the newsletter or on the podcast as I go forward. So thank you, Ken. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Leadership Tales podcast. And I'll look forward to welcoming you back on another episode soon.